The silence of the asteroid mining colony pressed against Marcus Webb, like a physical weight as he lay trapped between the massive hydraulic plates of the OR processor. His face crushed against cold metal that had become his entire world for the past. 47 hours every breath came shallow and painful through the small gap his helmet provided, and the faint hiss of recycled air reminded him that even this small mercy would end soon when his suit's reserves finally ran dry the evacuation. Alarms had stopped screaming 16 hours ago when the last escape pod launched from the dying station, carrying the final 3 members of his crew to safety while he remained behind. Pinned in the machinery like an insect, and Amber Marcus had volunteered to stay when the power systems began cascading failures across K477. Someone needed to manually override the emergency protocols or the entire reactor would go critical and vaporize everything. Within 1,000 kilometers, he remembered running through the maintenance tunnels as explosions rocked the station's core, his fingers flying across manual control panels that hadn't been touched in decades because automation handled everything until it didn't, or processor had been in the middle of a cycle when the power surge hit, its massive hydraulic arms designed to crush asteroid rock into manageable chunks. And Marcus had been reaching between the plates to disconnect a jammed pressure sensor when the whole system went haywire. The plates closed with the inevitability of continental drift, slow enough that he knew what was happening, but too fast for him to pull back. And the last thing he saw before his face pressed against the metal was his own reflection in the polished steel surface pane. Had been his entire universe for the first day, screaming into his helmet as his shoulder bones ground together and his ribs creaked under the pressure. But the suit's automatic medical systems pumped him full of enough drugs to keep him from passing out completely by the second day. The pain had become normal, just another part of existence like breathing or thinking. And he started talking to himself through the helmet's recorder because the silence was somehow worse than the agony. His crew had tried everything they could think of during those first hours, running calculations and simulations, but every scenario ended the same way, with Marcus dying. If they attempted to force the plates apart, Captain Rodriguez had stood in front of the machinery with tears streaming down her face as she explained that the hydraulics required a controlled power supply to open safely. And with the reactor failing, that power simply didn't exist anymore. Shea promised they would send help as soon as they reached the nearest station, that rescue teams with proper equipment would come back for him. But Marcus could do math as well as anyone. The nearest station was 3 weeks away at maximum burn, and rescue teams would need at least another week to organize and return. And his suit had maybe 4 days of life support left if he was very lucky, and very still so. He lay there in the darkness of the processing chamber with only his helmet lights for company, watching the battery indicator slowly drain toward 0 while his body gradually went numb from the sustained pressures. He slept and dreamed of his daughter Sarah, who was 9 years old and living in the colony on Europa with her mother, waiting for him to come home from this rotation with the presents he'd promised and the stories she loved to hear. Other times he stayed awake and thought about all the things he would never do, never see, never experience, and the unfairness of it made him want to scream, except he had no breath to spare for screaming on. The third day he started whispering to Sarah through the recorder, telling her all the things he wished he could say in person. How proud he was of her test scores in mathematics, and how she shouldn't be sad because he died doing something important. "I'll be like this forever," he whispered into the darkness as his suit's air started to taste stale and metallic. "Trapped between these plates, even after I'm gone." Just part of the machinery, the words felt true in a way that made his chest hurt worse than the physical pressure. Because he knew that when rescue finally arrived, they would find only a body fused with metal. Inseparable from the station itself, his vision had started to blur from oxygen deprivation. When the station's external sensors picked up something new, a vibration transmitted through the metal that pressed against his skull. The distinctive magnetic clamps of a ship docking with the station's emergency airlock. For a moment, hope flared bright and painful in his chest, because maybe rescue had come impossibly fast. Maybe his crew had found help closer than anyone thought possible. Then his engineer's brain reminded him that no human rescue operation would approach a failing reactor this carelessly, and certainly not alone without support vessels and safety teams. Footsteps that echoed through the station corridors a few minutes later confirmed his suspicions. Too light and too rhythmic to be human, clicking against the metal floor with a sound like glass chimes in a gentle... When Marcus had never met an alien in person, though he'd seen plenty of footage from the frontier colonies, humanity's expansion into space had brought them into contact with a dozen different species over the past 50 years. Some friendly and some less so, he tried to call out, but his voice came as barely a whisper, his lungs too compressed to draw the breath needed for shouting, and he wasn't even sure the approaching footsteps belonged to a species that could hear human vocal ranges. The clicking grew closer and then stopped somewhere. Beyond his limited field of vision, followed by sounds he couldn't identify. Soft chiming notes that might have been speech or sensor scans, or something completely outside his experience. Then a face appeared in his peripheral vision, or at least he thought it was a face. A structure of crystalline planes and faceted surfaces that caught the dim emergency lighting and split it into rainbow fractals. The being moved closer, and Marcus could see that its entire body seemed to be made of some kind of living crystal, transparent in places and opaque in others, with inner structures that pulsed with pale blue light like a heartbeat made visible. It had no eyes that he could recognize, but he felt the weight of its attention nonetheless. Some kind of scanning or observation that made his skin prickle with static electricity. Even through his suit, the crystalline being circled the machinery slowly, its movements precise and deliberate, and Marcus realized it was analyzing the situation with the same methodical approach he would take when examining a complex engineering problem. Several minutes nothing happened except observation, and Marcus felt hope dying again because, why? Would an alien salvager risk anything to save a random human, trapped in worthless machinery on a dying station? Then the being did something that surprised him completely. It reached out with one crystalline appendage and touched his helmet faceplate with infinite gentleness. And through the contact, Marcus felt something impossibly questioned formed in his mind without words or language, a pure concept that asked whether he still wished to live despite everything. Whether the struggle was worth continuing when the outcome seemed inevitable. Marcus didn't know how he was perceiving this communication, or whether he was hallucinating from oxygen deprivation. But he answered with every fiber of his being. With thoughts of Sarah and sunlight on Europa's ice, and 1,000 things he still wanted to experience, the crystalline being withdrew its touch and remained motionless for a long moment. And Marcus wondered if it was calculating odds or considering options, or simply deciding whether his life had value enough to warrant the effort. Then it began to move with sudden purpose, flowing around the machinery like water, finding a path through obstacles, and Marcus felt the faint vibration of tools or technology being applied to the hydraulic systems that held him prisoner. Whatever choice the alien had made, Marcus realized his fate now rested in appendages that looked like living glass, held by a being whose motivations he couldn't begin to understand. All he could do was wait and hope and try to keep breathing through the growing darkness. At the edges of his vision, while something impossible attempted, something that might be his salvation, or simply a different way to die. KSIL of the Vrin moved through the calculations with the cold precision that had once been its greatest. Strength before that same precision led it to heretical conclusions that doomed it, too. Exiled, a human trapped in the machinery registered as a failing biological system with approximately 4 hours of viable function remaining, crushed between hydraulic plates that required 47,000 newtons of controlled force to separate without causing catastrophic tissue damage. By every measure of Vrin logic, the cost-benefit analysis was clear. Attempting rescue would consume resources that KXTHAL needed for survival, would delay its salvage mission by dangerous amounts of time, and would risk damage to its own crystalline structure from the station's imminent reactor failure. The rational choice was to leave immediately, to let entropy claim the human while KSEAFL continued its endless wandering through the frontiers, forgotten stations, and abandoned outposts. Yet KX found its movements slowing as it completed the third orbital scan of the machinery, its sensory matrices recording details that had no bearing on the decision to abandon, yet somehow felt necessary to preserve the human's name was Marcus Webb, according to the identification markers on his environmental suit, and his vital signs showed a pattern of sustained determination that struck KXTHL as statistically improbable, given the circumstances. Most beings would have succumbed to despair by now, their neural patterns degrading into chaos or shutting down entirely. But this Marcus Webb maintained focus even as his oxygen levels dropped into the critical. Rangexel began moving toward the airlock, following the logical path that had governed every decision since its exile. But then the human made a sound that came through the helmet's external speakers. It was barely a whisper, and the words came halting and broken. But KX translation matrices parsed them anyway. "Sarah, baby, I'm sorry I won't make it home for your birthday." The Vrin stopped moving, and something shifted in its crystalline consciousness. Some fragment of memory that should have been irrelevant to present circumstances. Schalt remembered standing before the consensus of its people, presenting research that suggested integration with other species might strengthen the Vrin rather than dilute them. Elders had declared such thinking contamination, had stated that KXL's own neural patterns showed dangerous deviation from acceptable norms, had pronounced exile as the only remedy for such fundamental wrongness. They had told KSL it had no value, that its thoughts and discoveries and 300 years of research meant nothing because they violated the rigid categories. That defined Vrin civilization now. Here was a human that the universe had declared worthless in a different way, trapped and dying with no rational reason for Casey Ethel to intervene, and the parallel made something resonate in frequencies that Vrin were not supposed to perceive. Exil moved back to the machinery and began a detailed analysis of the hydraulic systems, mapping power flows and structural integrity with a precision no human engineer could match. The reactor was deteriorating faster than initial scans suggested. Cassathel had perhaps 40 minutes before cascade failure made the entire station uninhabitable, and extracting the human would require at least 35 of those minutes. It was madness by Vrin standards, risking permanent death for a being it had never met and would likely never see again. But KSL had already been declared mad by its people, so perhaps the designation no longer mattered. First step required establishing a biostasis field around the human's damaged tissues, a technology the Vrin had developed for preserving their own kind during dangerous crystal formation cycle skills. Extended filaments of specialized crystal into the gaps around Marcus's Webb's body, each strand thinner than human hair, but strong enough to pierce steel, and began weaving them into a lattice that would hold his cellular structure stable. The human made sounds of distress as the crystals penetrated his suit and flesh, and KXTEL adjusted the frequency emissions to include mild analgesics, though it knew the process would remain agonizing by human standards with the stasis field active. KSL turned its attention to the hydraulic plates themselves, analyzing the control systems that had failed so catastrophically during the power surge. Human engineering was crude but functional, designed for easy repair rather than optimal performance. And KXTHAL could see a dozen ways to improve the system, even as it worked to disable it. The plates required simultaneous release from 17 different pressure points to avoid torsional stress that would pulp the human's already damaged body. And KSIL grew 17 specialized appendages from its central mass to reach each point at one time, compressed into a narrow tunnel of absolute focus as KXTHAL worked, its consciousness narrowing to nothing but pressure calculations and structural analysis and the slowly failing rhythm of Marcus Webb's biological functions. Stations shuddered around them as another power conduit exploded somewhere in the depths, and Exiled recalculated frantically, adjusting the extraction sequence to compensate for the new vibrations. 15 minutes remaining before reactor Philorixthal began the separation process, applying precisely calibrated force to each pressure point while simultaneously extending the stasis field to support tissues as they decompressed. Webb screamed, a sound that would have been terrible in full volume but came as a broken whisper through his failing oxygen supply. And Casey Ethel felt something that Vryn should not feel. A resonance of suffering that made its own crystalline structure ache in sympathy. Plates moved apart with agonizing slowness, millimeter by millimeter. And KSL's sensors tracked 100 ways the human's body could fail before the process completed blood. Vessels ruptured and reformed within the stasis field. Bones ground and shifted. Organs that had been compressed to dangerous. Limits tried to expand too quickly and had to be held in place by threads of crystal light 10 minutes remaining. And the plates were only halfway separate, a separate texethal, made a decision that would horrify any Vryn, physician, and probably kill the human outright. It stopped relying on mechanical separation and began phasing Marcus Webb's body through the solid matter of the plates using quantum displacement technology. That process was theoretical at best and had never been tested on organic matter. It required KXThal to partially deconstruct the human at the molecular level and reconstruct him on the other side of the obstruction Marcus Webb's. Screaming stopped as his consciousness finally failed, which was a mercy because no being should be aware. During molecular disassemblics, all worked with the desperate speed of one who had already decided that failure was unacceptable, threading quantum states through solid steel, holding a human's entire pattern in crystalline memory while the universe tried to collapse the probability. Wave 5 minutes, and Marcus Webb's body emerged on the far side of the plates, still wrapped in the stasis field that was now the only thing keeping his catastrophically damaged tissues. Alavextal gathered the human in its appendages, cradling him with the same care it would show to fragile crystal formations, and began moving toward the airlock at maximum speed. Station's emergency system shrieked warnings about reactor breach as KSL sealed the airlock and activated its ship's emergency departure. Protocols 2 minutes, and the ship detached from the dying station, its engines burning at dangerous intensity to clear the blast. Radius behind them, K477 died in a flash of fusion fire that briefly outshone the distant sun, vaporizing everything that remained, including the machinery that had been Marcus Webb's prison inside KXThal's ship. On a medical platform designed for crystalline biology and completely unsuited for carbon-based life, Marcus Webb lay dying. Despite everything, his face was partially crushed beyond what even the stasis field could repair. His internal organs showed damage that human medicine could not fix, and his brain activity was fading toward the permanent. Silence of death still stood over him, running calculations that all ended the same way. The human would die within the hour, and all of this risk and effort would amount to nothing unless there was one option that no Vryn had ever attempted because it violated every principle of species purity that the consensus held sacred. The very research that had led to Cassie Ethel's Exiled integration, fusion, the combining of Vryn biocrystalline technology with alien biology. It might save him, or it might destroy what remained of his humanity. And Kazethel could not make that choice for a being who lay unconscious and dying. But then Marcus's Webb's eyes opened for just a moment. It's unfocused and glazed with pain. And he whispered one word. Sarah Kazel understood. The human wanted to live. Wanted to return to his daughter, even if the cost was everything that made him what he was, the Vryn. Began preparing the integration sequence, knowing that what it was about to do would mark them both as abominations in the eyes of their respective peoples. But KSL had been declared worthless once already, and Marcus Webb faced the same judgment from an uncaring universe, perhaps. Together they could prove that worth was not something granted by others, but something chosen in the face of impossible odds. The ship's medical bay hummed with frequencies that human ears could not detect, as KFL prepared the integration chamber. Adjusting parameters for biology it had studied only in theory and never in desperate practice. Marcus Webb lay suspended in the stasis field, his body a map of catastrophic damage that would have killed him already. If not for the crystalline web holding his cells in frozen time, his face bore the worst of it. The left side crushed where the hydraulic plate had pressed against his skull. Bone fragments visible through torn flesh, One eye socket collapsed into Ruingsthal sensors registered the moment when Marcus's consciousness surfaced briefly from the darkness, awareness returning just enough to perceive his situation. The human's remaining eye focused on Casey Ethel with effort that cost him dearly, and the Vryn felt the question forming in that damaged mind before it could be spoken. "You're dying," Exthal said through the translation matrix, its crystalline voice resonating in frequencies that Marcus's brain could interpret as words. "Human medical technology cannot repair the damage to your body." Marcus tried to speak, but only blood bubbled from his lips. And Casey Ethel adjusted the stasis field to clear his airway, granting him a few more moments of possible communication. "There is another option," Casey Ethel continued, knowing that what it offered was either salvation or damnation, depending on perspective. "I can integrate Vryn biocrystalline structures with your damaged tissues, essentially rebuilding you as a hybrid of both our species." The Vryn paused, needing the human to understand the magnitude of this choice. "You will live, but you will not be entirely human anymore. Your biology will be fundamentally altered in ways that cannot be reversed." Marcus's eye moved. Exthal's crystalline form, and then shifted toward the view screen where distant stars shone against the void. "My daughter." Each word costing him more life than he could spare. "Will I see her again?" Kazathal ran calculations that branched into thousands of probability streams, each one uncertain and dependent on variables that could not be predicted. "I do not know," it answered with the honesty that had made it outcast among its own people. "But you will have a chance." "Which is more than you have now." Marcus closed his eye, and for a moment Casey Ethel thought consciousness had fled again. But then the human's hand moved slightly, fingers curling in what it recognized as a gesture of agreement. "Do it," Marcus breathed out. And those two words gave Casey Ethel permission to attempt something no Vryn had ever done. To prove or disprove 300 years of forbidden research in one desperate experiment. The integration chamber activated around Marcus's body, filling with a mist of crystalline particles so fine they appeared as nothing more than shimmer in the air. Each particle was a seed of Vryn biotechnology, programmed to interface with organic tissue and rebuild it according to patterns that existed in the space between pure crystal and pure flesh. Thiel began with the face, where damage was most severe and repair most urgent, guiding the crystal particles into the crushed bone and torn tissue. The particles found purchase in Marcus's cells and began to grow, not replacing the human tissue, but merging with it, creating structures that were both crystal and bone, both rigid and flexible, both human and Vryn. Marcus screamed as his nerves registered the transformation, pain beyond anything the stasis field could suppress, his body fighting against the invasion, even as it desperately needed what the invasion offered. Maintain the process with grim determination, knowing that stopping now would leave Marcus worse than dead, transformed into something incomplete and unable to survive. The crystal lattice spread through the left side of Marcus's face, weaving through shattered bone and creating new structures where human healing could not reach. His collapsed eye socket filled with crystalline growth that formed into something resembling an eye but fundamentally different, a sensory organ that could perceive wavelengths far beyond human vision. The process continued down through his neck and shoulder where the hydraulic pressure had crushed vertebrae and damaged his spine, crystal threads wrapping around nerves and becoming new pathways for signals. His damaged biology could no longer transmute ours past as KSL worked, maintaining the delicate balance between too much integration, which would erase Marcus's humanity, and too little, which would leave him dead. The connection between them grew stronger as the crystal network spread. Vryn biotechnology carried with it fragments of collective memory that all crystalline beings shared. Marcus began experiencing flashes of KCFLS life, not as memories exactly, but as sensory impressions and emotional resonances. Translated into forms his human brain could process, he felt the cold beauty of Vryn cities grown from living crystal, structures that sang in the solar wind and pulsed with mathematical perfection. He felt KXThal's excitement at discovering that integration between species might create emergent properties neither possessed alone, strength and adaptability beyond what rigid purity could achieve, and he felt the devastating loneliness of exile, being cast out from the consensus and declared contaminated beyond redemption, wandering the void alone while former colleagues turned their sensory matrices away in disgust through the same connection, KX Thal experienced something equally alien and profound. The chaotic warmth of human emotion and memory flooding through the crystalline consciousness that had never felt such things. Perceived Sarah through Marcus's memories, a small human child with dark hair and her father's stubborn determination, laughing as Marcus pushed her on swings in Europa's enclosed parks. It felt Marcus's love for his daughter, an emotion so powerful and irrational that it defied every logical framework Rin used to understand the universe. It understood why Marcus had stayed behind on the dying station, why he had accepted the transformation, why human beings did impossible things for reasons that made no sense to cold calculation. The integration reached a critical threshold where Marcus's biology had been altered enough to sustain itself, where the crystal lattice had woven so deeply into his tissues that removing it would mean death's thou. Slowly withdrew from the direct neural connection, letting Marcus's consciousness reassert its boundaries while the physical transformation completed its final stages. Marcus opened his eyes. Both of them now, though the left eye was no longer entirely human. Its iris replaced by faceted crystal that caught the medical bay's light and fractured it. Into impossible colors he tried to move and found his body responding differently than before. Stronger in some ways and strange in others. His rebuilt muscles reinforced with crystal fibers that made them capable of forces that would have torn human tissue. His left hand had the same crystalline quality as his eye, the skin partially translucent so that the underlying structures were visible. Bones that gleamed like polished stone wrapped in networks of light. What have I become? Marcus asked, his voice rough and damaged but functional. And Cassiathal heard the fear beneath the words, something new. Cassiathal answered, neither fully Vrin nor fully human, but alive when you should be dead. Marcus sat up slowly, testing his transformed body, feeling the way his senses now extended into spectrums he had no names for, seeing the world in layers of electromagnetic reality that humans were never meant to perceive. He could see KX Thal's internal structures now, the way light moved through the Vrin's crystalline form, the patterns of energy that corresponded to thought and emotion in a being made of living stone. I can feel you, Marcus said wonderingly. Not just see you, but feel your presence in my mind. Like an echo, the integration created a permanent, low-level connection. We share certain neural pathways now. You will always sense my presence as I sense yours. Marcus looked down at his crystalline hand and flexed the fingers. Watching light play through the semi-transparent structures, Sarah won't recognize me, he said quietly. And KSEFL felt the sorrow in those words through their shared connection. She will, KXL replied with certainty it could not logically justify. Because you are still her father beneath the changes. Still the being who chose life over death so that he might return to her? Marcus stood on legs that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. Taking his first steps as something humanity had never seen before, he moved to the view screen and stared out at the stars. Seeing them now in ultraviolet and infrared and wavelengths he had no names for, each star a complex signature of radiation and gravity and electromagnetic song. What do we do now? Marcus asked, and the question contained multitudes of uncertainties. Ethel moved to stand beside him. Two beings who had both been declared worthless by their respective peoples, both transformed by the desperate choices they made in the face of death now, Case SL said. We discover what is possible when rigid categories no longer apply. 3 months of wandering the frontier had taught Marcus Webb how to live in a body that was no longer entirely his own, how to see in spectrums that would have driven his human brain mad. Without the crystalline structures that now helped process the overwhelming data, he stood in the cargo bay of KXThal's ship sorting through salvage from an abandoned research station, his hybrid hands able to identify materials by their electromagnetic signatures without needing visual confirmation. Work was meditative in a way his old life had never been. Each piece of salvage a puzzle to solve. And the constant low-level connection with KXThal provided companionship that kept the loneliness at bay, had settled into a partnership born from necessity and grown into something resembling friendship. Though Marcus suspected that friendship meant different things to crystalline beings than it did to human squeeze. Emerged from the ship's navigation chamber, its crystalline form refracting the cargo bay lights into dancing patterns. "We have a problem," it said without preamble, and Marcus felt the spike of concern through their shared connection. "What kind of problem?" Marcus asked. Setting down the plasma coil, he had been examining long-range sensors detect 3 Vryn hunting vessels on an intercept course. Exiled replied. "They are broadcasting identification codes that mark them as consensus enforcement. Sent to eliminate exiles and contamination." Marcus felt his hybrid heart rate increase. The crystalline portions of his cardiovascular system compensating for the surge of human adrenaline. "They're coming for you," he said. "Though it was not a question, they are coming for both of us," KSL corrected. "You are proof that my research was valid. That integration between species creates viable results. They cannot allow such proof to exist." Marcus moved to the navigation chamber where holographic displays showed the approaching vessels as points of angry light against the starfield. "How long until they reach us?" He asked. "Approximately 4 hours at their current velocity," KXL answered. "They are faster than this salvage vessel and will overtake us before we can reach any human settlement." Marcus studied the tactical display. His human military training, combining with the enhanced processing capabilities, his crystalline structures, provided. "Can we fight them?" He asked. 3 enforcement vessels carry enough firepower to vaporize a small moon, Casey Ethel said flatly. "This ship's weapons are designed for cutting through salvage, not combat." Marcus felt the fear response trying to overwhelm his rational thinking. But the crystalline portions of his neural network damped the panic, allowing him to think clearly. "Despite the danger, then we run," he said. "And we use every trick we can think of to stay ahead." The next 3 hours became a desperate chase through the asteroid field that surrounded the dead system they had been salvaging. Piloted with the precision its species was known for, threading the ship through gaps that would have been suicide runs for human reflexes, Marcus worked the sensor arrays, using his hybrid perception to predict the patrol patterns of the hunting vessels and find temporary hiding spots among the tumbling rocks. The Vryn hunters pursued with methodical determination, their tactics logical and predictable because they assumed their quarry would behave according to standard Vryn patterns. But Marcus thought like a human, chaotic and creative and willing to take risks that no rational being would consider. "Take us into the ion storm," he said, pointing to a region of space where stellar wind created electromagnetic chaos that would blind most sensors. "The radiation will damage the ship's systems." Kazathel protested. "Their ships too," Marcus countered, "but we're smaller and more maneuverable. We can get through faster." Kesiathel hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, calculating odds, and then changed course toward the storm. The ship shuddered as they entered the ion-saturated space. Radiation alarms, screaming protests that Casey Ethel silenced with a thought. Marcus felt the electromagnetic chaos through his crystalline eye, seeing the storm not as danger, but as beautiful patterns of charged particles dancing through the void. The hunting vessels followed, but had to slow their approach. Their larger hulls more vulnerable to the radiation that could fry their system cells. And Marcus emerged on the far side of the storm with a 30-minute lead. But the tactical display showed more problems ahead. "There are 2 more vessels joining the hunt," KSE Ethel reported. "They anticipated our trajectory and positioned themselves to cut off escape routes." Marcus stared at the display and felt despair trying to creep in. 5 Vryn warships against 1 salvage vessel. The outcome seemed inevitable. Then his hybrid mind made a connection, piecing together fragments of information from KXThal. Memories that had leaked through their neural link. "You said there were other exiles," Marcus said suddenly. "Vryn who questioned the consensus and were cast out like you?" "Yes," KSL confirmed. "Scattered throughout the frontier, hiding in places where the consensus does not look." "Can you contact them?" Marcus asked. An idea forming that was either brilliant or insane. "They maintain communication channels for emergencies," KXThal said slowly, beginning to understand where Marcus's thoughts were leading. "Then call them," Marcus urged. "Tell them that the consensus is hunting hybrid technology, that if they destroy us, they'll come for anyone who ever questioned the rigid categories." KSL broadcast on frequencies that Marcus's human ears could not perceive, sending messages that rippled through quantum states and reached across light years in moments. The responses came slowly at first. Cautious acknowledgments from Vryn, who had learned to hide and survive alone, but as KXTHL shared data about Marcus, about the successful integration and what it might mean. The tone of the responses changed. These were scientists and philosophers who had been exiled for asking forbidden questions, and Marcus represented answers they had spent lifetimes seeking within. An hour, 3 exile vessels appeared on the tactical display. Old ships and modified platforms, nothing that could match the consensus warships in direct combat, but they brought something more valuable than firepower. They brought knowledge of the local space and hidden routes that the consensus charts did not include. Exiles led KSL ship through a series of jumps that used gravitational anomalies and unstable wormholes, paths that required split-second timing and a willingness to risk instant death. Marcus found himself working alongside KX Stal at the navigation controls, his human intuition guiding them through choices that pure logic could not calculate. They survived jumps that should have torn the ship apart, threaded through spaces that existed only in probability, and emerged in a region of space that the tactical computers claimed was impossible to reach. The consensus hunters fell behind, their rigid programming unable to adapt to the chaotic routes the exiles employed, but they did not give up. And their final transmission burned across all frequencies with the weight of absolute authority. "This is Enforcer Zixrel of the Vryn Consensus," the message announced. "The exile KSA Ethel and its contaminated hybrid will be eliminated. All vessels offering assistance will be designated hostile and destroyed." Then came a second part of the transmission, broader and more devastating in its implications. "Be advised that human colonies in sectors 7 through 12 have been designated potential contamination vectors," Skrell continued. "Preemptive sterilization protocols are being prepared to eliminate the human infestation before integration can spread." Marcus felt his blood turn cold despite the crystalline modifications that regulated his temperature. "They're going to attack human space," he said, horror and rage mixing in his voice. "They're planning genocide because they're afraid of what we represent." KSL's crystalline structure pulsed with patterns that Marcus had learned to recognize as deep distress. "The consensus fears chaos above all else," it said. "Humanity's unpredictability, combined with Vryn technology, would create something they cannot control." Marcus stared at the tactical display where human colonies were marked as small dots of light, each one containing thousands or millions of lives. Sarah was on Europa, in Sector 9. "Directly in the path of the planned attack, we have to warn them," Marcus said, his voice hard with determination. "Even if the consensus destroys us, humanity needs to know what's coming." The exile vessels transmitted their agreement. Former consensus scientists, who had spent lifetimes believing their civilization represented the pinnacle of advancement, now forced to confront its capacity for atrocity, setting course for human space. Kessie Ethel announced. "But we will be intercepted before we reach any major settlement." Marcus felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. They could run and hide and let humanity face extinction unprepared, or they could try to warn their respective peoples and likely die in the attempt. He looked down at his crystalline hand and thought about the transformation he had undergone, how he had whispered that he would be trapped forever in the machinery. Instead, he had been freed into a form that neither humanity nor the Vryn could accept, something new that threatened the rigid categories both species use to define reality. "Then we make them listen before they can silence us," Marcus said. "We show them that integration is not contamination, but evolution." The Terran Defense Fleet detected the approaching vessels 40 minutes before they crossed into human-controlled space. Sensors screaming alerts about unknown ship configurations traveling at velocities that suggested either hostile intent or desperate flight commander. Sarah Webb sat in the tactical center of Europa Station, her dark hair pulled back in the severe style favored by junior officers who wanted to be taken seriously despite their youth. She was 23 years old and had never stopped looking for her father in the 6 years since he disappeared from the mining colony on K477, the distress beacon from the evacuation pods had reached Europa 2 months after the incident. Survivors reporting that Marcus Webb had stayed behind to save them, that he died when the reactor went critical. But no body had been recovered, and Sarah had spent years scanning salvage reports and frontier transmissions, hoping for evidence that somehow her father had survived now. She stared at the tactical display, showing vessels that matched no known configuration, heading directly toward Europa, on a course that would bring them into weapons range within the hour. Hail them again, she ordered the communications officer. Frustration evident in her voice. No response on standard frequencies, the officer reported. But we're detecting transmissions in formats our computers can't decode. Sarah was reaching for the emergency protocols when a new signal cut through the interference. Audio this time, and in a voice that made her heart stop. Europa Station, this is Marcus Webb, requesting emergency docking clearance, the transmission said. And despite the strange resonance beneath the words, it was unmistakably her father's voice. That's impossible. The tactical officer said what everyone was thinking. Marcus Webb is listed as killed in action 6 years ago. Sarah found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. Authenticate identity with security question Delta 7. There was a pause that lasted 3 heartbeats before the response came. Your 8th birthday, I gave you a telescope, the voice said. And you asked me if we could see heaven from Europa? I told you we could see something better. We could see tomorrow. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes because nobody else could know that conversation. It had been just the two of them on the observation deck in the middle of station night. Grant emergency docking clearance, she ordered, her command voice cracking slightly. Have security teams standing by the ship that docked was like nothing in Terran records. Organic curves mixed with geometric precision. Materials that seemed to shift between solid and crystalline. Marcus Webb walked down the boarding ramp, and Sarah understood why the authentication had been necessary. Because the man approaching bore only passing resemblance to her father. The left side of his face gleamed with crystalline structures that caught the station lights and fractured them into rainbow patterns. His eye on that side was no longer human, and his movements had an inhuman grace, but his smile was the same. Sad and hopeful, and filled with love that transcended the physical transformation. Sarah, he said. And she stopped caring about the strangeness because this was her father, who she had mourned for 6 years. She crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, feeling the strange texture of his hybrid body, but also the warmth that proved he was alive. We need to speak with your command structure immediately, Marcus said, his altered voice carrying urgency that cut through the reunion. Humanity is in danger. Within the hour, Marcus and KSL stood before the Terran Military Tribunal, facing questions from admirals and civilian leaders who could barely comprehend what they were seeing. Marcus explained everything. The accident that had trapped him, KSL's choice to attempt rescue, the transformation that saved his life, and the Vrin consensus's plan to eliminate human colonies before integration could spread. Tribunal members listened with expressions ranging from skepticism to horror. And when Marcus finished speaking, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. You're asking us to believe that an alien empire plans to commit genocide because of what you've become, Admiral Chen said finally. And your only evidence is the word of an exile. In the existence of your own transformation, the Vrin hunting fleet is 3 days behind us, KSL added, its translated voice resonating through the chamber. They will arrive and attempt to destroy this station to eliminate Marcus and any evidence of successful integration. Then we evacuate and prepare defensive positions, another admiral suggested. We don't need to trust the word of an alien exile to know that a hostile fleet deserves a response. Sarah spoke up from her position against the wall, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 6 years studying everything. Known about frontier species, the Vrin consensus has never been openly hostile to humanity before, she said. If they're coming now, it suggests we've crossed some threshold that we didn't know existed. Marcus looked at his daughter with pride, seeing how she had grown from the child who asked about heaven into a young woman who thought strategically about interstellar politics. Sarah's right, he said. The Vrin see rigid categories as fundamental to civilization. The idea that species can integrate and create something new threatens their entire worldview. So, we're facing war because you decided to become a hybrid? Admiral Chen asked, his tone suggesting this was somehow Marcus's fault. Stahl's crystalline structure pulsed with patterns that Marcus had learned to recognize as anger. You face war because my people are afraid of change, the Vryn said, and because they would rather destroy potential than accept that their understanding might be incomplete. The debate continued for hours, with some tribunal members arguing for immediate military response while others suggested trying to negotiate with the approaching Vryn fleet. Marcus felt the frustration building in his hybrid chest as valuable. Time was wasted on arguments that missed the essential point. Finally, he stood and spoke with a force that silenced the room. All thinking about this wrong, he said. You're treating the Vryn threat and my transformation as separate issues when they're fundamentally connected. He held up his crystalline hand so everyone could see the way light moved through the semi-transparent structures on proof that integration works. Marcus continued that combining human adaptability with Vryn technology creates capabilities neither species has alone. I can interface with computer systems directly through thought, he demonstrated by accessing the tribunal's display systems without touching any controls. I can see in spectrums that reveal structural weaknesses in materials. I can process tactical data faster than any human analyst. The Vryn fear this because it proves their rigid categories are limitations, not strengths, Marcus said. But humanity could embrace it. Admiral Chen leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to calculating interest. You're proposing we create more hybrids? He said slowly. I'm proposing we offer the choice to volunteers, Marcus corrected. People who understand the costs and benefits, who are willing to be transformed to gain capabilities that could protect humanity. The room erupted into argument again. Voices raised about ethics and humanity's definition and whether transformation constituted a form of death. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. My father died 6 years ago in that machinery. The man standing here is both him and something new. And he crossed half the galaxy to warn us about a threat we couldn't have seen coming. She moved to stand beside Marcus, her support visible and unequivocal. If volunteers are willing to undergo transformation to protect humanity, who are we to refuse that choice? She asked. The tribunal debated for another hour before reaching a decision. They would allow Marcus to present his proposal to the military and scientific communities, would permit volunteers to undergo the integration process, but would not mandate anything. More importantly, they would send diplomatic channels to the Vryn consensus, would try to negotiate before the hunting fleet arrived. Marcus knew the negotiations would likely fail because the consensus did not compromise on matters they considered fundamental. But the attempt had to be made. Over the following 2 days, a dozen volunteers stepped forward. Scientists and soldiers who understood the risks and wanted to be part of humanity's answer to the Vryn threat. Xthal performed the integration procedures with the same care it had shown with Marcus, creating hybrids who each emerged changed but still themselves. Watched her father work alongside the alien who had saved his life, saw how they moved in perfect coordination through their neural link, and understood what they represented. On the 3rd day, the Vryn hunting fleet arrived exactly as predicted. 5 warships carrying enough firepower to devastate Europa Station, but they found something unexpected waiting for them. A Terran delegation led by Marcus Webb and supported by a dozen other hybrids. Requesting permission to board and present evidence, the Vryn enforcer, Exiled, agreed to receive them, though its translated transmission dripped with contempt for contaminated beings. Walked through the corridors of the Vryn flagship with the hybrids behind him, feeling the consensus's cold disapproval radiating from every crystalline surface. They were brought before Exiled in a chamber that hurt to look at. Pure crystal formed into geometric perfection that rejected any hint of organic chaos.